Online workshop, Institutional Gender Analysis, session 1. We will see each other quite a bit in the next 2 weeks. So thanks for coming. I hope everybody can see my screen. And let's get rolling. So first of all, who are we? What is Gender Equality Academy? And what are their objectives? So the first thing that we are doing is to develop and implement a coherent, high quality capacity building program on gender equality research and innovation that is based on the state-of-the-art knowledge and expertise. It provides tailor-made training material, and we have different target groups: decision makers, HR equality officers, researchers, many other people you can find in research and innovation institutions. And we're delivering training in different formats. Back in the days, it was in-person trainings. I'm sure all of us missed those. We have workshops, webinars, summer school, and docs that are also delivered online. What are our learning objectives for this training? To introduce the concept of gender plus analysis or gender plus audit. I will explain what this plus means, what's its purpose, its coverage, incorporating an intersectional perspective to it. To clarify the rationale of institutional gender analysis, what, why, how, and when to assess, and what their follow-up steps are. To introduce the different methodologies available to do the analysis. To support a participatory approach to the gender equality analysis or institutional gender analysis, what a participatory approach means and how to encourage that. To highlight the importance of building sustainable data collection systems and regular monitoring. To present and discuss with you strategies to efficiently mobilize collected data for the design and redesign and implementation of actions. A bit of the workshop outline. Today, day 1, we will first go through an introduction, present what is institutional gender plus analysis, the getting ready phase of it, context, support, success factors, and common obstacles. We're going to let you breathe in a 20-minute pause and to come back to key areas for analyzing gender equality and particularly what to analyze in a gender equality assessment. We're going to show you what it means to develop and analyze indicators in a first part, in a theory part, and then we're going to leave you in breakout rooms for practicing in these developing and analyzing indicators. I will take care of the rest in the following. Who are we? That's me on the left, a little bit outdated photo. I didn't have a fringe back then. I have to definitely take a new one. I'm the Gender Equality Officer for the Supera project, another sister project on basically on developing gender equality plans in higher education and research funding organizations in Europe. And I work for Central European University, who was previously in Budapest, Hungary, but we were basically kicked out by the Hungarian government, and we are settled now in Vienna, Austria. Now I give the word to my co-trainer.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, everyone. My name is Kareem, and I'm a consultant based in Aberdeen, Scotland. My background is in research and innovation management, and I have two main interests. One is in responsible research and innovation, RRI, and diversity and inclusion. So I'm very interested in everything to do with embedding gender mainstreaming and in embedding diversity practices so that we can have a more inclusive research culture and way of working in academia. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karim.
I wanted to jump here a bit of overviewing the expectations from all of you that you yes, basically communicated with us, or most of you who communicated with us. I'm going to jump here to, can you see my mirror board? Hopefully, yes. If not, please yell at me. So I basically collected all of your expectations and put them in different colors. The ones on purple are the ones that we will definitely address. The ones in green are the ones that we will partially address. And the ones in blue, the ones that are a bit too broad, and we will not be able to take all of that scope in our training. So let's start with data collection methodology. Two people agreed that that was their expectation, and we will totally talk about that. How to prepare documents and the analysis, what is crucial in the gender, in institutional gender analysis, and what are their supporting tools. So definitely we will take care of this. Then improving theoretical and methodological knowledge on gender analysis, where this could be applied to analysis in courses and research. We will not dig into gender equality in research and innovation, but most likely, hopefully, this person will be able to take away some knowledge that can be applied to trainings and courses. Another expectations is how or what we should monitor and what are the current practices in monitoring gender equality actions in European Union structural change projects. We will address a bit of monitoring at the end. This is not the focus of the course, but we will realize that monitoring and gender analysis, of course, go hand in hand and very similar in content. An overview of all stages and considerations involved in inclusion work related to gender. We won't overview all of them. We will focus on institutional gender analysis, but we will give you an idea of the rest of the steps. Again, I just copied this twice. Gender analysis for budgeting. We won't focus especially on budgeting, but we will in gender analysis, and this will totally be, with this knowledge, you will be able to inform your budgeting. And how to reach gender equality within organizations. Again, we won't do the entire scope of how to reach gender equality, rather focus on the analysis, but this is a very important start point for reaching gender equality, hopefully. How to measure gender inequalities in society is too broad of objective. We will focus on institutions and gender equality and its future. Very interesting topic, but it's definitely out of our reach. So I will pass now the word and the floor to Karim.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So you're here to do a workshop on institutional gender analysis. So I always think it's useful to define what gender analysis is. So here's a couple of definitions. The first one is from UN Women, and they say that gender analysis is a critical examination of how differences in gender roles, activities, needs, opportunities, and rights and entitlements affect men, women, girls and boys in certain situations or contexts. Gender analysis examines the relationships between females and males and their access to and control of resources and the constraints they face relative to each other. So quite a big definition that's covering a lot of different aspects, but the thing that stands out for me is really looking at differences. The next definition is from the World Health Organization, and here, they define it as a process that identifies, analyzes, and informs actions to address inequalities that arise from the different roles of women and men, or the unequal power relations between them, and the consequences of these inequalities on their lives, their health, and well-being. And I really like this definition because it encompasses health and well-being, which nowadays is very important, and especially because of the COVID-19 situation, there is more of an emphasis in institutions on well-being and the general good aspects of health. So what I'd like to talk about now is some of the inadequacies of these definitions. The first one you may have noticed is that they're very binary. They talk about men and women, males and females, and that's not very inclusive. There's also the fact that it's not covering a full and exhaustive list of items that gender analysis covers. It's being very high level and broad, saying it's just about examining differences in power, in resources, and in constraints. And so we always have to remember that this is a starting point for a definition, and when you start to look in the literature, you'll find that there are other definitions that might feel more relevant for your particular context. And of course, if you're working in international aid or international development, then they use different indicators, quite often economic indicators. So what? Gender analysis is really important that we perform it in a systematic way, because it is a process and it needs to be quite scientific in the way that it's conducted. And it's based purely on sex disaggregated information. If you do not have sex disaggregated information, then you cannot find the gender disparities, and then your process doesn't work. And we use it in order to develop a comprehensive situational analysis in order to increase our understanding of the gender issues and challenges, and in order to promote our gender mainstreaming. So if you start with a goal of gender mainstreaming, you need to have a way of understanding what is the current situation and where you want to go, and how do you measure progress towards that end goal. And so many of you are coming from a research environment or a university, and in the context of that environment, a gender analysis would cover all areas of the operations of that environment. So recruitment and career progression, for example, work-life balance, and we're going to talk a lot about different aspects throughout the training today. These are really key principles of gender analysis. And now I'll pass to Anna.
I'm going to discuss a little bit what this gender plus analysis means, and which basically, in short, this means to incorporate an intersectional approach in institutional gender analysis. The term intersectionality, for some of you who might not know what this is about, although I really doubt it, given the expertise of most of you in this particular topic. This term was coined by the Black feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1999, so way ago, in an article titled "Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination, Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics." She is basically an American lawyer, and she's a leading scholar of critical race theory. Intersectionality basically is a theoretical framework that explains how aspects of a person's social and political identities do not add up, but rather interact to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. For example, Crenshaw states that the experience of being a Black woman cannot be understood as an addition of being Black and being a woman, considered independently and separately, but they combine in a way that reinforce each other. Examples of these social identities are, for example, non-binary gender identities, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, social class, religion, disability status, age, parental status, citizenship, among others. And these intersecting and overlapping social identities may be both empowering for some groups or oppressing, or both at the same time, because people are, and groups are intersected by several of these identities at the same time. What is it that intersectionality brings to the table? So basically, it broadens the lenses of the first and the second wave of feminism, which was largely focused on the experiences of women who were both white and middle class. And now intersectionality includes the different experiences of women of color, women who are poor, migrant women, and other groups. Now jumping a bit already in the intersectional gender analysis, and exactly what's the position of this step, of this phase in the wider gender mainstreaming cycle. So first you will see in the middle of this graphic, the gender equality plan design, which is basically the plan that we have to put together and implement to reach or improve the status of gender equality in our organizations. And the first step is the step of getting started. This getting started involves the role of context in your work, the importance of getting support, the success factors, and the common obstacles. I'm not going to dive into that right now because both Karim and I will address them very soon. And the gender analysis is actually the second step of the gender mainstreaming cycle. You will find this under different names: gender analysis, gender audit, gender equality diagnosis, or baseline assessment of gender equality. So this is what we're going to focus on, but this is the overall cycle of gender equality plan design. The third step, just to mention them so you have an idea of the overall context, is to set up the JEP, so basically to design what the gender equality plan is going to look like. And of course, the design of this JEP is intimately related to the results of our gender audit. Because in our gender audit, I can assure you, you're going to find lots of gender inequalities across many areas of analysis, and your gender equality plan will try to tackle those inequalities and put together actions and implement actions to overcome them. The fourth step, once you have your gender equality plan designed, is to actually implement it, which brings, as you might imagine, a lot of challenges and a lot of resistance and obstacles in each institution. But it's basically to put in practice or bring forward those actions that you envisioned in the JEP design. The fifth step is basically monitoring and evaluating the gender equality plan. So you're going to put forward several actions, and after those actions are implemented, you will have to check whether they were successful or not, or partially successful in addressing the inequalities that you have discovered in the initial analysis. And most likely you won't be able to, or you're going to realize you couldn't tackle them all, or there's only partial success or non-success at all in some of them. And then the cycle begins again. Now, the part of getting ready. So the step number one that I anticipated, I'm going to give the word now to Karim.
Thanks, Anna. So the next phase is understanding the context, and that's really key because context really matters. And the first part of that is understanding the legal basis for gender equality. So there is a framework for this, and you can start at a very high level before drilling down. So of course, there's the UN Foundational Charter, which mentions biological sex as a equal opportunities dimension in terms of what the UN is trying to do. But there's also European Union laws, and if you're not joining us in the European Union, then this doesn't apply to you. But for example, you have various directives that are all related to the equal treatment of men and women in employment and social security, for example, in self-employment activity, and to protect pregnant workers as well. But in your own country, there will be national laws too that are specific. and are very clear about what is allowed and what is not allowed in your particular jurisdiction. It's really important to know these things. And there is, oh, I've jumped a bit too fast. So can I just go back a slide? There we go. To understand the difference between equal treatment, positive action, and gender mainstreaming, because there are differences between these three items, and the legislation that applies in your particular region may not allow certain types of positive action. So for example, you may have heard in the news that in Germany, they've proposed the idea of having gender quotas. This is a form of positive action, and they have a very strict and narrow definition of where that applies, in what contexts. So senior management of companies that are listed on the stock exchange, for example. Not all types of positive action are allowed in all countries. So it's really important that you understand what is possible and what is not possible. Gender mainstreaming is something completely different. That's about promoting participation and embedding equality. And equal treatment is about, in the eyes of the law, having the same treatment for both men and women, males and females. Again, this is very binary, and not all countries recognize non-binary genders. So it's really key that if you're an institution that wants to promote a truly inclusive culture, that you can go beyond what the legal requirements are in your particular jurisdiction. So beyond that context, there's also a policy framework that is really important. So that might be an institutional policy and procedure. And quite often, what people don't realize is that institutional procedures can exacerbate and make inequalities worse just because of the way that the processes work. Government might have targets or certain policies to promote participation. And of course, the European Union also has broad objectives, for example, as part of the European research area. So that just a few months ago in November, they published their new European research area strategy. And I want to zoom in on number 12, which is to develop concrete plans with member states to promote gender equality, as well as diversity and inclusiveness in science, research, and innovation. So this will be very important for research organizations, universities, higher education institutes. And so if you are based in the European Union or the European Economic Area, or even as part of the European Neighborhood Policy involved in transnational research and innovation cooperation, this is going to be particularly important. And you may have noticed that in the Horizon Europe program, they have now demanded more reference to gender equality plans as part of the proposal process. So it's very good to see that there are some political processes that translate into the reality of research and innovation operations. And of course, there's a social context, because not everyone is aware of the issues that men and women face in different ways, and they might not have a level of interest in these issues. I know it's very difficult to imagine that because we're a very engaged group, but in many organizations, the level of interest amongst the general population of staff may not be as high as you would expect or want. And so there needs to be some work to raise awareness, to engage and motivate people to see the issues and to tackle them, discuss them more broadly. So that context is very, very key. And so when you think about the context, there's some important factors to consider. And I'd like to start by talking about the actual situation where the organization is based. So we have location as a very key one, because there are differences in the opportunities and inequalities between urban and rural environments. So if you're, oh, my slides have moved, there we go. If you're based in an institution that is in a rural environment or even on some islands, so for example, I'm based in Scotland and we have some remote islands where They do have higher education colleges that are part of a federal university called University of the Highlands and Islands. When you're based in these remote areas, there are particular challenges that you face as an island community, but also in the employment and economic conditions that are available to you due to a lack of connectivity, for example, or difficult circumstances. So we might all take internet access for granted and mobile data, but that's not available in all areas, and that can affect the opportunities as well. And then, of course, there's institutional characteristics, and these, there's a long list here. Resources and finances often is the biggest one that institutions will tell you is the case for not having dedicated resources for tackling gender equality. It might be about internal structures and governance and how those are structured, whether it's a centralized or a decentralized type of organization. The culture and the history of that particular institution. If it's a very old one, it might have a particular outlook that takes a lot of time to change things, and as well as the formal nature of these environments with Senate, Academic Council, and various governing bodies. But the biggest one that I think makes the difference is policies. Having policies that are monitored and actually operationalized that create the difference so that you can point to a document and you can force the institution to stick to what they said that they were going to do. And so these factors are really important. And when you do part of the gender analysis, looking at all these things is really important, because if you don't take it into consideration, the types of interventions that you decide on undertaking may not be appropriate. For example, for a very, very large institution, 3,000 or 5,000 staff members, you would need a lot more resources, time, effort, and energy in order to undertake your training events and make sure that the change is embedded across all the departments, all the faculties, all the research institutes, and all the units. If you have a very small institution of less than 1,000 staff, the level of resource will also be different. So all these are very important as part of that gender analysis. So as we move from the dark valley of inequality and issues to the other side, the green pastures, where we promote gender equality, where we have an inclusive environment that encourages diversity, there's a number of things that we need to think about. We've already talked about that legal context. We've mentioned the characteristics of the institution. We've also talked about the environment more broadly in terms of economics and the regional space. But beyond this, it's about taking people with you on a journey. And so I want to talk about that more next. So you need to find the support from different members of your staff community in order to identify potential allies. And you do this with a stakeholder analysis. And a stakeholder is basically someone who will have a positive, neutral, or negative impact on your change initiative. And quite often, people don't realize that anybody who is affected by the change or whose active support or commitment are needed, or even just a behavior change in order to successfully implement your gender equality plan sustainably, are stakeholders. So you can't leave people out. It is everyone that is involved in making and embedding that change. But people aren't the only things you need. Sometimes you need money. You need finances to employ consultants and to access expertise. So where can you find the resources to do that? Research funders in your country. It might be the European Commission through initiatives like Horizon Europe. They have a lot of coordination and support actions. And in the introductions, I was very happy to hear about some of the gender projects that you're joining us from. Your institution might have some internal funds and budget. But when you think about what does this actually cost, mostly it's time and effort. You only really need a budget if it's to employ external consultants, or if it's to create new posts or create infrastructures which are really important, like an equal opportunities office or a new role that is specifically there to promote diversity and inclusion. And so I think I've covered quite a comprehensive aspect, and I'll pass back to Anna. Thanks, Anna.
I'm going to jump now to talk a bit about the success factors for a gender mainstreaming efforts and about the common obstacles. So all the success factors that I compiled here and come from the GEAR tool that I absolutely recommend you to read and use. All of these appear in the entire gender mainstreaming efforts, but I highlighted in purple with an asterisk those that are also specific to institutional gender analysis. So success factors cover all of the steps that we discussed previously, but the ones highlighted apply specifically to gender audit. So the first one is senior management support at your institution. So explicitly and clearly communicated support from top management will give legitimacy to your gender equality efforts and reduces the chances of institutional resistances in all steps of the gender equality plan. By top management here, we're referring to decision-making positions, just like rectors, vice rectors, the provost if it's a university, deans, presidents, executive directors, and also to central governing bodies, such as the Senate, committees. This very much depends on your institution. Support from these positions makes it easier to mobilize institutional resources, as Karim just mentioned, both financial and human. And it can also reduce people's fear that they might harm their scientific or professional reputation by engaging with gender equality work. Since, as you know, in many institutions, gender equality work is considered to be only a feminist initiative, and there are a lot of negative connotations associated with feminism. So engaging in this kind of work could potentially reduce your reputation. So counting on senior management support will reduce the chances of that happening. Second success factor is a well-equipped and well-located gender equality body. This means not only a gender equality body that has expertise on the topic and allocation of the budget, but also has an appropriate location within the institutional hierarchy that will enable this team to design, so to carry out the analysis, to design the JEP, and to implement these gender mainstreaming initiatives. This means mostly to have proximity to decision-making bodies. So most likely you are not going to be the person or the body with decision-making power, but hopefully you will be close enough in the institutional hierarchy to those decision-making bodies. The third success factor is the cooperation among different stakeholders or categories of stakeholders. Karim just mentioned and introduced us to the definition of what a stakeholder is. And this cooperation is key to conduct a proper assessment of the gender equality status in your university, as Karim mentioned earlier. Building alliances with these key stakeholders and getting them involved from the very beginning of the gender mainstreaming efforts will increase their sense of ownership in the project and participation in the further steps of design and implementation. And let's jump now to the collection, so the availability of sex disaggregated data. So also, as Karim mentioned before, there is almost nothing that can be done at the institutional level, institutional gender analysis. And of course, in the following steps of the gender equality plan if we don't have collection and access to high quality sex disaggregated data, both quantitative and qualitative. This is not only indispensable to audit the status of gender equality, but also for future monitoring efforts that we will address in the last day of this training. So the important thing here is not only to have this data available to you, but also, and we will discuss this later, that you can access to this data. So not only that the data is collected and recorded, but also that you can access to it. And this is a very important thing, and you will see why a bit later. And then the other factor is competence development. Carrying out a gender equality assessment, as you might imagine, needs specialized knowledge and expertise from people in your organization who can properly design methods to collect data and then to analyze this data. Competence development is also indispensable for the following steps of the gender mainstreaming cycle. And now, what are the common obstacles that we will find? Once again, these obstacles are taken from the GEAR tool, and I highlighted for you the ones that play a specific role in institutional gender analysis. The first one is resistances, and we could devote, trust me, an entire day to this topic. Those of you working already in gender equality plans might be too familiar with what resistances are. Of course, due to time constraints, I will try to summarize the main aspects of resistances. Resistances are those actions and inactions on the side of the institution that impede and block the advancement of our gender equality work. They may come from individuals or from the institution, and they are there to protect the status quo and will appear at all stages of the gender equality plan. So these resistances you will see are there from the very beginning when you start doing the assessment. These resistances can be both actions, as I mentioned earlier, and these are called explicit resistances. Generally, they come in the way of active opposition. But they can also be inactions, and these are called implicit resistances, and they come often in the shape of lack of time and lack of resources. So those in powerful positions in your institution will resist measures that might bring shifts in this power balance. And of course, as you might imagine, members of privileged groups are often quite shocked and angry when their privilege is challenged. The second common obstacle is that there can be a fundamental lack of understanding in your institution of the need for gender equality in the organization. This can lead to basically lack of engagement and involvement of the key actors, the key stakeholders. And there are a couple of ways of overcoming this. Some basic and possibly mandatory training on gender equality for all staff and students, if you come from a higher education institution, might be required in the form of, for example, awareness raising, communication campaigns and workshops, trainings. And this would help building a collective and shared understanding of the importance of gender equality as an institutional priority. Another important common obstacle specific to institutional gender analysis is the lack of sufficient ongoing resources, both human and financial, for this initial assessment. And then, of course, for developing, implementing, and monitoring the gender equality plan. The time required to develop and implement this GEP and for the initial analysis, for the assessment and the drafting of the plan needs to be acknowledged by the institution and properly resourced. What happens generally is that institutions do not invest in gender equality efforts, what they generally do is that they add gender equality work to the workload of already overburdened staff. So they add this responsibility on employees on top of their common workload. And this actually leads to very poor progress or very slow progress. And of course, lack of motivation, and people tend to get burned out very easily. To avoid this pitfall, it is important that the resources that are needed are clearly agreed upon with the leadership in the early stages of the process. So before starting with your auditing efforts, you have to have an understanding and agreement with your top management of what the resources, the added resources that are going to be invested in this effort. So, lack of institutional or organizational authority. So the team or the person that is involved in the design and the implementation of the gender equality plan, and of course in the institutional gender assessment, may not really hold the authority or the decision-making power to drive change in the organization. And this can lead to frustration, to limited progress, and to blockages. This can only be overcome by, as I said again, early involvement, commitment, and support from top management, and a well-located gender equality team in the hierarchy of the organization. So most likely, as I said before, you're not going to have high authority in the organization, but you have to be well-placed and close enough to those with decision-making power. Lack of relevant data and statistics. So a lack of availability or a lack of access to sex disaggregated data is a disastrous thing to have, since this data is required for the initial assessment of the status of gender equality. There's nowhere you can go without this. Having data at hand is also needed, of course, to counter potential resistances with up-to-date facts and figures. And this especially works in academia, where people are very used to having intellectual debates and to promote efforts and also to resist efforts to have up-to-date facts and figures on gender inequality in the world in general, but in your institution in particular can come in very, very handy. Data protection policies here, well known like as GDPR, are a major challenge to collect and to access data, especially in small organizations. I will not talk more about this topic right now, because both Karim and I will address it at a later stage of this training. So engaging key actors, engaging potential allies, engaging stakeholders already in the institutional gender assessment phase is very crucial for a successful assessment. Middle management positions, so here I'm not talking necessarily about the top leadership, but of middle management, so heads of units, for example. These people, these positions are key resources of data, statistics, and gender disaggregated information. So to get your data, you're not going to go to top leadership, but you have to have a good alliance with middle management, because they have the data that you need, that you will require for a proper diagnosis. And of course, later on to monitor the progress of your actions. And you will need to factor in the time for this ally building work. So this is going to take time from your work, and it's not something irrelevant, this ally building work. This can be done in the way of trainings, awareness raising workshops, but also very important to have in mind, informal channels. So you will create alliances not only through formal training that you can deliver, but also through your networking efforts in your own institution. And this is, of course, important to reduce obstacles and resistances at all phases of the gender equality mainstreaming process. Another common obstacle might be the lack of previous history or tradition in your institution of engaging with gender studies. This will make it more challenging for you, for us, to convince the different stakeholders of the importance of our work. This obstacle requires collaboration with equality networks also outside of your institution, for example, at a national, regional, or international level. And also, and I would say more importantly, to develop in-house gender expertise, if you don't have it already, via trainings to enhance, of course, the institutional competence in this regard. Now, let's start focusing or zooming in into institutional gender analysis. I'm going to present here what we're going to analyze when we perform an institutional gender analysis. What are the areas that we are going to cover? And you will see there are 5 key areas for assessment. And these are based in Horizon Europe requirements, but I'm going to make a disclaimer here. Each institution might find, or different institutions might find that these 5 key action areas should be rearranged, reshuffled, put together according to previous efforts of the institution, according to some strategic approach. So just to give you an example, I'm going to read this out loud, and I'm going to give you an example of how, at least in my institution, we reshuffled. Doesn't mean that we don't cover them, we do, we must, but in a bit of a different way. The key areas, according to Horizon Europe, for institutional gender analysis are work-life balance in organizational culture, gender balance in leadership and decision-making, gender equality in recruitment, career progression and retention, integration of a gender dimension in research and teaching content, and measures against gender-based violence, including sexual harassment. So at least in my institution, we grouped together 1 and 3. So work-life balance in organizational culture was put together with recruitment, career progression, and retention because of strategic matters, because of the way that our previous policies were shaped. And we added a 6th key action area that is very important for us to improve, which is basically institutional strategies or institutional strategies on or requirements on data collection, storage, access, and analysis. So we, in our the institution had previous attempts to improve gender equality and diversity in general. And we always run into very important data gaps and gaps in accessing the data. So this we thought required another key action area in itself. So these are the aspects, these are the key action areas you have to cover. It doesn't mean that you cannot reshuffle them or add some on top of these if you see it fits your institution better. And then in these key action areas, we will have 3 main topics to analyze. Also, I will share them with you. They are explained in the gear tool. These 3 main topics we have to analyze per key action area. So we have to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for each of them, analyze 3 main aspects. The first one is reviewing relevant legislation and policies in your country and region including those which are specific to research institutions and or higher education. To give you an example, here in Austria, there's an Universities Act that covers all public universities. Central European University is private, so we don't fall under that. But that University Act has specific requirements for higher education institutions and has a couple of articles related to gender equality. So bear in mind that you have national legislation and policies, but also some specific policies or legislation regarding higher institutions or research institutions. As Karim said before, if there are national targets regarding gender equality and also targets and requirements related specifically to institutional assessment, for example, publishing gender equality gaps or running gender pay gaps in your institution and make it public, that will help you in the gender equality design phase and in the entire mainstreaming cycle, because it will strengthen your arguments to convince these different stakeholders, including senior leadership, that gender equality measures are needed in an organization. Then the second topic that you have to analyze in these 5 key action areas that might sound a bit repetitive, but it's crucial and indispensable, so I think it's worth going through it yet another time, is to analyze sex disaggregated data about both staff and students if you're in a higher education institution. If not, then just the staff. So this first step is to check which data is collected and is readily available for you. If you detect gaps in the availability of data on any key action area, you will need to push the institution to start collecting it. And it can be one action of your gender equality plan that the institution has to start collecting data on one area that is where the data is lacking. So this can be part of your gender equality plan. You detect data gaps and you put that target, that goal in your gender equality plan. This sex disaggregated quantitative and qualitative data should include an intersectional approach, intersectional perspective. We should integrate other dimensions in the analysis other than binary gender approach, such as age, race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, religion, and so on and so forth. But another disclaimer here, is important to bear in mind that this can unfortunately lead to GDPR. You will find GDPR constraints here, so data protection, because especially in small institutions, the low number of staff and or students with particular intersectionalities might lead to being able to identify which individual that data comes from. And this is not correct and not legal from a GDPR point of view. For example, you have only one Black woman who is a professor in your institution. So you cannot disclose that data. You cannot publish that data in your analysis. So that's a big disclaimer you have to bear in mind. And then for each key action area, do identify the existing measures promoting gender equality in your institution. This can be both formal, such as policies, and informal. So basically informal arrangements or informal practices that different units have to tackle gender inequality, but were not translated into formal policies. So in case of the formal policies, we have to check their quality, basically what they say, the level of implementation. So are these policies taken up or not? and the enforcement mechanisms. Because sometimes you have that letter there, that text is there, but it's there's no implementation, or since there are no enforcement mechanisms, then nobody is obliged to follow the policy. Most institutions have at least a couple of these measures in place. Tamara was mentioning in her institution, there are already some policies tackling either gender equality or diversity more in general. So these measures have to be, we need to make an inventory of these measures, and they have to be mapped in order to diagnose where the gaps are and if there's any room for improvement of those policies that are already in place. Involving different stakeholders in the process, again, can prove extremely valuable because they can inform us about the deficiencies in the implementation of such measures. For example, conducting interviews or focus groups with the people who are target of the policies that we have in place to ask them if they consider there are gaps there, if the quality can be improved, or if there are any problems with the implementation of such policies.
We're now going to move into talking about indicators, because when you do a gender analysis, this is really important. So I thought it would be very useful to begin by actually defining what an indicator is in gender mainstreaming. So basically, an indicator is a statistic that has been standardized or has a reference point in order to enable comparisons to be made. And so, for example, the total number of female staff in an organization, it is a statistic, but it's not really an indicator because it cannot be compared across different organizations because of the size, or over time periods because it's just a number. So for this, you would need to use a sex ratio, females to males, or a percentage of female staff, so that you might have 49% of staff are female, and you can compare that year on year, and you can also compare that with other organizations. And it would, of course, be more inclusive to report non-binary as well. But as Anna mentioned, it's not always possible to do that due to GDPR constraints, to data constraints, etc. Now, the indicators that we develop, and I'll be talking about this over the next couple of slides, really needs to have a few characteristics that are important. The first one is that they have to be valid, so that what we want to measure is what the indicator is actually doing. Specific, so that it's only measuring the particular aspect that we are wanting to measure. And it also has to be reliable, so that when we measure it time and again, it's giving us the same type of response, and it's consistent, so with a very low random error. In addition, we need to be able to have comparable aspect. So if you're using a different indicator, I'll give you an example to define this point. So if you're measuring net pay versus gross pay, those are comparable because your gross pay will determine your net pay after tax. So you can use indicators like that. Non-directional, meaning that you should be able to measure both a positive change and a negative change, so in either direction, or of course staying the same. And in order to have an indicator, you must be able to actually collect the data first and be able to verify and prove and audit that data. So for example, if you are using payroll information to determine your gender pay gap, you'll be able to point to that data. It's not made up. And I've been talking a lot about numerical information here, but I just want to make the point that there are qualitative indicators as well, and I'll talk about those in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. But I just want to make sure that we have a full picture, that when we refer to an indicator, it can be also about a narrative assessment, and these are usually around judgments, perceptions, and measuring a kind of more text-based change over time. So if we're developing gender sensitive indicators, there's a few things we need to bear in mind. The main point to remember is that we're measuring something, so it needs to measure a differential between males and females, Again, that's a very binary example, but it does need to measure a difference. And so usually that's around access and control over resources. It's also about the power in decision making. So decision makers that are available in the organization, in committees, and on legal rights and status as well. So you should be able to monitor the different opportunities that are available to men and women and be able to report on those. So do they have equal protection and policies in your organization? And of course, it's always important to remember that there are equally interests that women have that may not necessarily already be measured in your current normal sets of indicators that your organization uses. It can also be around time, how much time is spent performing certain tasks, or how long it takes to achieve certain career milestones. So for example, we know that in many academic professions, it can take women longer to reach those senior career milestones compared to men. So your indicators can measure all these things and more. And it's really important to measure the change at different levels. So you have output indicators, and usually output is about the results from the intervention. You can have your impact indicators that really give you more information about the long-term direct or indirect change, indicators around the process, so what activities have happened, but also it's important to measure inputs. You know, what are the financial and human and material resources that went into the process. But when we think about gender sensitive indicators, we need to think about them not just in a silo, but developing them with others. And so co-production is really essential. And this is for a number of reasons. It needs to meet the needs of different users. They also need to feel ownership of those indicators. And it has to be a collaborative process. And the reason for that is when you do an institutional gender analysis, you're looking at different organizational activities. And so for that, you need different expertise. So if you just have academic staff and no administrative staff, then you will omit a number of really important aspects. Likewise, if you just have administrative staff and you don't involve the whole community of academics, researchers, and the different professional services that make the university or research organization run, then you will have gaps in that analysis. So it's really important to co-produce that. And so when you think about co-production, you can use brainstorming sessions. You can also look at what existing reporting takes place at the different levels, at the high governing body level, at the middle management level that Anna alluded to earlier, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel. If there's already data that's being sent to different places and already being collected, quite often it's just a case of repurposing that and having access to it, knowing about it, so that it can be tracked in the context of a gender analysis. And when you think about indicators, you can use examples from other EU projects. Other institutions have also published their gender equality plans and have done their gender analysis and have made it publicly available. So you can use those for inspiration. It doesn't always have to be from scratch. There is a lot of resources out there that have already done quite a lot of work and validated some of the indicators. So using standards that already exist are very useful. And through this process, you will identify areas that require new data collection for which you need to put in place new processes and identify new sources. When you're doing a gender indicator analysis exercise, you might need the help of experts, and it might be gender experts, it might be diversity and inclusion experts. It's really important to bring in that expertise in order to support the process, especially if your institution doesn't have that kind of knowledge in-house. And I always find that sharing the experience with colleagues in the sector is really important. So, for example, here in Scotland, the universities have formal but also informal groups where different staff share their perspective, their experience on different issues. So, for example, I was part of a European Liaison Officers group where it was pretty informal group, but there's 14 higher education institutions here in Scotland. All the European officers who deal with the European Commission on Horizon Europe, for example, we met up once in pre-pandemic times in person. We met up for a meeting for half a day to talk about issues, and there was always a nice agenda, and it was about 2, maybe 3 times in the year to have those kinds of knowledge exchange. And you can have really a lot of value from understanding what other organizations in your own country are facing, get ideas, and also understand how they've managed to face their obstacles. So, we've talked about what an indicator is, and we've talked about how you develop them, but, what does it do and how do you use it? So very simply, an indicator, it helps you understand whether your work is making a difference, because it describes a change which takes place over time, a change that you can observe, and it provides the evidence that something has happened. That's why it's really important. But how you use it, it's very simple. You have to gather the information at a baseline when you start the process. You then measure that change over time. So you just keep recording that information. And then you have to report that status over time, whether it changes, whether it stays the same, goes up, goes down. And you integrate this in the context of a gender equality plan. So it sounds very simple and very nice, but let's talk about this in more detail. So some examples of indicators: gender pay gap, you'll have heard this, it's very common. Some of you have already talked about it. You might have a percentage of women or men nominated to senior positions, and this talks about power and decision-making. Or you might have a percentage of women and girls who report feeling and or experiencing discrimination on the basis of gender. What I would say is that when you have a statement like senior positions, you need to define what that means for you in your organization, and it should be clear. So for academic staff, it might mean those who are at professor level or above. For administrative staff, it might be a certain grade or above. It's really key that you know what senior means, and that your definition over time might evolve, but it's important that you have the data to be able to make those comparisons robust and fair, and that you are not vague about it. I alluded to this a couple of slides ago, this idea that there are quantitative indicators that measure more numerical data and qualitative indicators that measure non-numerical data. And together it approaches giving you a whole picture, but it's not the full picture, but it is trying to get towards that. There's of course hybrid indicators as well, where you combine both. And there's some examples. The last one that I put here as an example: percentage of women and girls who report feeling or experiencing discrimination. That's an example of a hybrid indicator. So one is a measure of quantity, and one is more about perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, about mainstreaming gender knowledge, about the uptake of gender equality objectives, and it's about practice transformation. So these are really important principles to bear in mind. What is the purpose of an indicator, how it works, and the combination of quantitative and qualitative in order to give you something that approaches a whole picture.